I guess it's still morning, so I could say Guten Morgen. And I could also say Shalom, Salam Alaikum. And since I was born in Jamaica, I could say, how you keeping? And I hope you're all keeping well. I'd like to thank Marcus Gabriel and Dr. Stefan Zimmer for organizing this meeting, getting us all together. These tasks are not very easy to do, but it's a lot of work. And thank your staff as well. So I begin with a story. Last Friday, I was on a flight from Atlanta to Providence, Rhode Island. I need to get there because the next day I was going to fly out of Boston to come to Munich and then over here to Bonn. And on the flight, along the way, I befriended a gentleman sitting next to me. And then there was a strange sound, a rumble in the plane, and we heard the pilot say, "Uh-oh." And I turned to the fellow, and the fellow was next to me. He said, I think a goose or a duck went through the engine, and the engine is gone. I said, how do you know? He says, I'm an engineer. What kind? He says, I'm a jet engineer. So then the pilot comes on. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to turn around to get back immediately. One of the engines is gone. And the plane is rumbling and we're going back. It's very odd how your priorities get. I was thinking, am I going to make my flight the next day? But on the way, as we're going, he said, well, what's the conference you're going to? And I said, Realism. A little perspective there. Now, the ideas I'm going to talk about can be found in several of my books and writings, especially Disciplinary Decadence, and in some essays I've written. One of them called Theory in Black for a journal called Qui Parle, and the other one, Philosophy, Science, and the Geography of Africana Reason, and Theory and Methodology, Philosophy, Science, and the Geography of Reason, which were published in the Russian Academy of Science. Now, the upshot of this, and what I'm going to talk about, is going to be some of the prospects for neorealism that we can find in African diasporic philosophy. But in addition to that, I'm going to explore some problems in ways that are both familiar and unfamiliar. The familiar, of course, is that some of the times when we go through some of the issues that challenge realism, a lot of them go back to these paradoxes from antiquity. We can think of Zeno's paradox, for instance, which basically would come about to whether there can be no time or no movement, to which we know some of the classic responses. But we could also think about how some of these tend to present arguments that appear valid, but they sacrifice existence, as Merleau-Ponty would say in a phenomenology of perception. However, some of the things I'm also going to talk about really are going to be connected to some misrepresentations about how we talk about things such as phenomenology and things such as intentionality. There's a tendency, for instance, to psychologize the question of intentionality, and in so doing, take it out of its relational aspects. But what I'm going to argue, however, is that properly understood, it makes absolute sense within the framework of realism. Okay? Now, that said, I'm also going to be critical of certain kinds of discussions that tend to privilege as first philosophy epistemology. And often when they do this, they often presuppose certain forms of philosophical anthropology. Now, what's very strange about this is we've seen some of this even yesterday, because one of the questions, he's not here today, but I spoke about it a little last night with Searle. I kept wondering why he kept using human civilization when he spoke instead of culture. And his response was rather interesting. He said, culture has too much baggage. But it seems to me that human civilization has a lot of baggage as well. Especially if you go back to the 19th century, there was a whole area of philosophy known as philosophy of civilization. And within that framework, of course, there's not only the etymology of civilization in terms of the city, but there's the complex question of whether you can have culture and not necessarily civilization. In addition to that, there are some other problems that are raised when we talk about some of these issues, and we've seen hints of them in some of the talks. There's the problems, for instance, of a form of indebtedness or attachment to substance metaphysics versus what we could call a relational metaphysics, right? I don't see how substance metaphysics of the self, for instance, or mind, could avoid ultimately solipsism. And I don't see, right, and even that has some real, albeit a distorted one. Moreover, there's a tendency to explore the social world when you use the substance metaphysics as though we do not also inhabit that world in first and second person relations. Now, the attachment to substance metaphysics also leads to theodicean problems. I was very pleased to see yesterday in Professor Kieran's talk a mention of theodicy. Hegel, for instance, has observed that there's a tendency to move toward theodicy in the history of philosophy, but this tendency continues in a variety of ways, okay? And in fact, I could relate some of it through my own experiences of graduate school, since there are some doctoral students in here, and as well since there are some early professors. One of the things I noticed when I was a doctoral, I don't want to seem a little bit odd here, but you do notice I'm the only black person on the panel. And I guess with Akil, there are two Indians, because I'm also Indian. But when I was in graduate school, one of the things I noticed was that when I read a lot of modern texts, there were many discussions of black people. And as I read these discussions of black people, I'd go to my peers, my colleagues, and I'd ask about these discussions in the text, and they would often say, "What are you talking about? That stuff isn't there." And in fact, as we know, a lot of the ways we do philosophy, we completely do philosophy as if race and those issues are completely irrelevant. But of course, I would argue with my colleagues, and we'd go back and we'd look at the texts, whether it's by Kant or Hegel or Marx or others, or Nietzsche, and discussions of blacks would be there. And the response of a lot of my peers were often, "How come I didn't see that?" Or, "If it's there, perhaps it's not that relevant." But of course, that's a complicated issue because we're in a profession where many of us write whole dissertations and even one sentence of these thinkers. And so what counts as making something very relevant seems to be dependent upon something more. What becomes even more complicated, of course, is that I think they misunderstood what I was talking about when I would say, let us look at those passages in those texts. Because I think they went on the defensive and thought I was perhaps baiting them into a debate over whether to read the texts at all. But actually, I wasn't doing that. You see, what I was doing was actually asking for us really to read those texts. So the question emerges, why were they not reading those texts? And I call this phenomenon the theodicy of the text. It is where one reads a text as if it is a sacred text, or if the author were a god. If the author were such, it would mean that the imperfections would have to be in the reader, or they'll have to be external to that text. Now, I never started with the premise that anybody I read in philosophy is not a human being, which means that when I read those texts, I expect for the text to reflect some of the contradictions and complexities of human authorship. The task of proposing a new realism, then, it seems to me, requires not simply looking as the way we have at the question of the real in the question of nature, but the question of realism also pertains to the question of how we deal with reality in the very texts we read. The task of proposing this, then, requires, in addition, I would argue, to the usual moorings in philosophy of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, movements, I would argue, inspired by African diasporic philosophy of the question of philosophical anthropology, the problem of contingency and freedom, and the one that I think most pertains to a lot of what we're doing in this meeting, what I call the metacritique of reason. Now, quite a few of us have talked about belief. And one of the funny things about belief is that belief has a metastructure of self-reference as well. And as many of us know, the moment you can get into self-reference, in other words, your belief about your belief, you begin to generate certain paradoxes. So, for instance, you can have the paradox of your investments in your belief, which could make you, in effect, believe what you don't believe. Now, in some areas of philosophy, for instance, some of the writings of Sartre, he referred to this as bad faith. And when you look at a lot of the literature and discussions of bad faith, a lot of people try to argue about how you can break down bad faith by moving into good faith or moving into sincerity and authenticity. But in fact, Sartre rejected that, and I reject that. What I argue is that the opposite of bad faith is actually a critical relationship to evidence. Okay? Because if you're locked in your internal beliefs, you've already turned away from the evidential conditions that can contradict them. Now, once we begin to see this, we know already there's an evidential sociality to evidentiality. But this leads to a problem of reality. Now, many of us, if you think of the bad faith example, can only take reality in small doses. And the neurotic, for instance, prefers simply to avoid it, since it means ultimately that which cannot be controlled, or at least only partially controlled. This leads to a variety of crises that's going to link to what I'm going to talk about, and these are crises of knowledge and disciplines, and they often take three routes. Now, there are other routes, but they often take three. One of them is an appeal to scientific naturalism. The other one is an appeal to historicism. And another one is a retreat to the resources of language. I've seen the cycle recur in many instances. Okay? The scientific naturalism response often asserts the primacy of science. Okay? And in it, it usually tries to present a conception of the relationship of rationality to reason that would, in effect, make science supervene, paradoxically, over reason. We could call this the scientific colonization of reason. Now, there are others who have spoken about this. You're familiar with this already. Jaspers talked about this when he talked about, for instance, reason having a nasty habit of being able to draw out paradoxes and contradictions. He called it the mystification of the understanding. And Levi-Strauss talked about it as the mythopoetics of reason. But one of the basic elements of it, of course, is that when we would like to yoke reason to rationality, we demand of reason that reason be consistent. There is, however, a familiar problem we have when we use consistency as the model, because one of the things that we demand from reason is that reason evaluates rationality as well. If you start with the question of consistency, and this is what many of you are familiar with, you raise the question of how consistent can you be? If you're going to be maximally consistent, if you're going to go all the way down the road, then you can never generate a contradiction. The problem, however, is that in the human world, and in the world in which we begin to get to higher order levels of evaluation, we find ourselves evaluating rationality, and this begins to create all kinds of problems. Now, this kind of a problem emerges as well in the social sciences, because there's some, for instance, who attempt in the social sciences to bring a form of ordered, consistent rationality to it. But the problem, of course, is as W.B. Du Bois pointed out in his essay, Sociology Hesitant, quote, sociology is the science that seeks the limits of chance in human conduct. In short, the social world also has to deal with contingency. Now, the historicist response often collapses into the primacy of history. But often when we look at the historicist response, it tends to take a form that eventually points to something in the way the naturalistic move points to something that would function as a form of relativism. This is something many of you are familiar with when Husserl, in his essay, Philosophy is Rigorous Science, complained about reductive naturalism and reductive historicism. However, the move from there to get out of it often takes a form of moving to language or semiological resources in which one looks at the conditions by which one can actually deal with the phenomena at hand. Now, I bring these up because I like to introduce a concept. And the concept, especially since I heard from Marcus's introduction that Nietzsche was here, it's inspired a little by him, and it's a concept I call disciplinary decadence. Now, you may say, what is disciplinary decadence? Well, disciplinary decadence has many forms. In one form, disciplinary decadence is a form of methodological fetishism in which one turns away from reality. We're familiar with this, many of us as scholars, in the examples where you can produce your research and there are those who are simply interested in looking at what method you used, instead of whether your findings hold on whether you deal with reality. Reality becomes irrelevant, simply following the method. Methodological fetishism takes a form also of methodological deontologism. But the problem with methodological deontologism and methodological fetishism is that they presuppose an original isomorphism between the development of the method and all of reality. You see that earlier remark I made about theodicy? If you come back to it, it would mean that the initial method, because it has the scope of the entire of reality, it would function almost like God's view on reality. Okay? The next version, of course, is disciplinary reductionism. And this is where one attempts to bend the world into one's disciplinary perspective. And this is where we usually have a form of disciplinary nationalism or chauvinism, where members of a discipline would criticize other disciplines for not being part of their discipline. And I think you have all been familiar with this. This is where the literary scholar criticizes the philosopher for not being textual. It's where the historian criticizes the literary scholar for not being historical. It's where the natural scientist criticizes both for not being scientific. And it's where the philosopher comes in, of course, and criticizes everybody. Now, of course, we can go on and on with those, but they lead ultimately to disciplinary solipsism, right? And this is where the discipline becomes the world, okay? Now, the theodician dimensions of these should be self-evident because it means ultimately in the same kind of classic arguments that are used in theodicy. If you look at the classic arguments in theodicy, they take the form of saying either one, the limitations of being a human being means you do not understand the scope of what God is arguing. In other words, God is fine, something's wrong with you, and that will account for the injustice or contradictions in the system. Or two, God gave you free will and you screwed it up. Both versions bring God off the hook, and it brings the accountability on the human being. But of course, simply eliminating the theological ascription doesn't necessarily mean we've eliminated the theological grammar. And the theodician mode of argumentation can continue in secular form. Now, there are forms in which the disciplinary model can function axiomatically. And as an axiomatical and instrumental conceptions of rationality, we can see that argument about maximum consistency leading out in such a way that a discipline treats itself as complete. So the kind of argument that I was using about textual theodicy, you could see how it works its way out in disciplinary completeness, and you could see, many of you are familiar with logic here, what's right around the corner. Because, of course, what's expected from the discipline is for it to be sophisticated enough to be able to evaluate itself and other disciplines, which means that it is going to deal with a problem of its own completeness or incompleteness. Now, if we radicalize this, disciplinary decadence leads to a very distorted view of evidence, where even proof, and this is where it gets really weird, because the reason it's called disciplinary decadence is if you think of the methodology in a discipline as emerging out of an effort to respond to or to give an account of reality, there's a certain point where the discipline turns away from reality and begins to focus on itself so much that it's no longer growing. It begins to create itself, its own domain, as its world. And as it turns inward that way, that means that it's no longer growing. Like a living organism, it's now in a process of decay. What's paradoxical about this, of course, is that in this process of decay, it presupposes its own health. In other words, to demonstrate that it's simply focusing on itself won't be a sufficient argument, because it'll ignore it and see its automatic production of its system as a sign of its own continued health. Okay? Now, how does one really deal with this? Because eventually what happens is that as more and more of the disciplinary structures begin such that they turn away from reality, it means if people come up, such as we, to start to talk about reality, what reality would they be interested in except those within the framework of the discipline? Well, one of the ways out of this requires going a little bit north and borrowing something from Søren Kierkegaard, and I call it a teleological suspension of disciplinarity. A teleological suspension of disciplinarity involves a discipline going beyond itself for the sake of reality. In the human sciences, it can become more evident when we attempt to squeeze people into our disciplinary presuppositions. We begin to realize if the people don't fit, the error would be to do the Theodician move and say something's wrong with the people. And so if we begin to adjust the methodology to the people, we're now going beyond the discipline to reality. If we look at a lot of the great revolutions in science and in philosophy, many of them were similar. If you look within, for instance, the presumption that one could work purely within a Newtonian universe, or the presumption of scholasticism, or if we look at a lot of the other presumptions in terms of what constituted proper philosophical work, there were periods in which there was an upsurge in philosophy precisely because those philosophers or those theorists began to say it doesn't matter to them whether they're philosophers or not. And as a consequence, it's no accident why in the history of philosophy there was Nietzsche the philologist, William James, at first the anatomist and then the psychiatrist, Hume the lawyer, Hegel the theologian, and we can go on, because they began to realize what the limitations were of what they were working in, and they needed to engage in a teleological suspension of those. Russell in mathematics, Wittgenstein in engineering and mathematics, we can go on and on. And so what we begin to see is that an attuned relationship to reality is generative in philosophy. Okay? We know that Husserl began as a mathematician, and the effort to ground mathematics in purely mathematical form made him encounter certain limitations, especially in terms of his engagements with Frege, which made him reconsider what he was doing and he began an exercise of going beyond mathematics. Now, at first, if one is going to present a teleological suspension of disciplinarity, and by the way, I mean, these may be some new terms to some of you, but I'm hoping they're useful. The initial response of many is to say that, isn't this an argument for interdisciplinarity? But I argue that that doesn't work. Because if each discipline meets with the presupposition of itself as complete, then the disciplines are like ships passing in the night. In addition to that, if one is going to think about the resources that will be necessary to engage in a teleological suspension of disciplinarity, one begins to work with certain almost paradoxical claims. For instance, those examples I was giving before of philosophers are philosophers who are willing to go beyond philosophy. But ironically, the way in which they go beyond philosophy generated new philosophy. Well, similarly, the question of drawing upon other disciplinary resources requires the communicability of those disciplines, and that communicability I call transdisciplinarity. Now, the communicability of disciplines and the way in which they begin to generate new knowledge could be seen in many areas of research outside of philosophy as well. We've seen it, for instance, in what happened in biology in the movement to the gene. And we see what has happened in the study of genes as resources beyond old-style conceptions of biology come into play and bring an understanding and different models of how to deal with the building blocks of life. We know, similarly, that when philosophers began to look more into mathematics, it'll be very interesting if some philosophers would think beyond certain models that are limited to, say, Euclidean geometry or basic mathematics or simple logic. In string theory, for instance, there's theorizing at levels that can deal with dimensions. In some cases, I was speaking with James Sylvester Gates about this, they work at the level of theorizing around 18 dimensions. And once we begin to get into dimensions, we begin to realize something very different about how we can talk about reality. Because, for instance, if we work within the old models of simply 2 dimensions, we tend to speak with simple spatial intersections. Whereas if we were to make it more complex and think through the many ways in which we live through the human world, levels of meaning, the dimensions through which we think of mind, time, the ways in which we think of various orders, we begin to realize that we may need a much more sophisticated way of dealing with the teleological suspension of our disciplines. Of course, what this means is that disciplines come and they go, and we may face new disciplines as we begin to generate these forms of knowledge. I remember when I was chair of Africana Studies at Brown University, I went to argue the case for the tenure of a colleague, and another professor was there, another chair. He was from computer science, and he was arguing for his colleague, and he said, "How long has Africana Studies been around?" I said, "Well, computer science hasn't been around that long, has it?" And then he stopped and he realized, he said, that's true. And of course, that's an insight into something profoundly Durkheimian, which is when we create our disciplines and they become institutions, it's as if they have always been. And this is one of the reasons we collapse into this form of decadence. We forget that disciplines are born, generated, and new disciplines will come into being. Now, some of the arguments that we've been using raises some questions analogous, first, to the question of how we deal with the meeting of different languages. And there's a philosopher by the name of Kwasi Wiredu in a book called Cultural Universals and Particulars, where he raises some very interesting discussions that really debunk the idea that different linguistic schemes, so to speak, cannot meet. And he argues that it's precisely because we work within a model always of translation. So if you think about when I talk about disciplines meeting, the initial response of many is to think that you have to translate one discipline into another. However, that's not the way language works, and it's not necessarily the way disciplines would work if you go back to the gene example. Sometimes when languages meet, there are untranslatables that we simply learn by virtue of originally having learned a language. And so having a discipline may enable us to enter into other disciplines to produce new disciplines. If this is correct, then it means an erroneous way of approaching disciplinary meetings would be the subordination of one discipline to another, or what I would call the colonizing of knowledge practices. Now, there are other thinkers who have brought up this issue. If you look in Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mass, for instance, he was particularly concerned with the problem of what we call epistemic colonization. I raised the question of the scientific colonization of reason, but as we know, if we think about high colonial modernity, it also involved the epistemic colonization of the very ways in which whole groups of people could appear. It began to create, in Theodician language, problem people. And so when Fanon wanted to address this issue, he needed to be critical not simply of the colonized epistemic outcomes, but he needed also to deal with the methodological presuppositions themselves. In other words, colonization at the level of method. But now he faced a very big problem. And one of the things I've argued in my work, I've argued this in a book called Fanon and the Crisis of European Man, and I've also argued it in a variety of other places. He began to face the same kind of problem that Husserl faced when he wanted to justify phenomenology. It's the same kind of problem, interestingly enough, that was faced in the very problem to ground mathematics with Russell and Whitehead. It's this big problem that we find all the way through a lot of 20th century philosophy with the problem of philosophical reasoning. And that is, if he is going to to articulate the legitimacy of his practice, he could not presuppose its legitimacy. But this led to a rather strange conundrum. And that is, one now has to develop a relationship to reality with a method that's not a method. How do you do this? And this becomes one of these moments at which we're now dealing with the question of meta-reflective evaluations. What kind of a proof are you going to, in effect, perform? Now, there are a lot of debates around this issue, and I'm just going to offer one of the ways in which I read not only how Fanon did this, but at least the way I read the way Husserl did this, and a variety of others, not only them. It pops up in a lot of places. The standard story, of course, is that there is the mighty philosopher, the mighty theorist who comes out and says, almost like Moses, I have a theory and it is complete. And then there is, of course, the Gödel types who pop up and say, maybe not. Well, you'll find this not only in terms of Dewey, you'll find it in Peirce, you'll find, this sort of maybe not, in Sartre, because Sartre imagined in his Transcendence of the Ego that Husserl showed up and said, I have the transcendental ego, I can articulate the conditions of all reality. And Sartre shows up and writes in his Transcendence of the Ego that it isn't happening. And his arguments, of course, we're familiar with them, but a lot of his arguments, many of you know, misread and misunderstood Husserl. And so I want to give at least a portrait of this in a way that might relate to some of the conversations we were having. And of course, we begin with the question of How do you evaluate your very methodology, your very presuppositions? If he's evaluating phenomenology, he cannot presuppose the validity of phenomenology. If he's evaluating logic, he cannot presuppose the validity of the logic. Okay? And so he begins to put them to the side, and we're familiar with this procedure. He talks about this in Cartesian meditations. We see this in transcendental and formal logic. We can, so we eliminate a lot of these things. We begin to start this process, put as many things away as we can, until we get to the point where, without presupposing anything, we ask the question of evaluating any theoretical matter whatsoever, any thought, any idea. And what do you think you arrive at? Well, one of the things that's fascinating is a lot of people, when they read that kind of an effort, I don't want to call it an argument, they presume that what is sought is a discursive kind of proof. But if you can, as you move back, reach a point where you cannot go any further except in having the very problematic of an object of investigation, the very problematic of an inquiry, what's peculiar about this is it has a particular structure. And if you look at the structure, it is the very structure of intentionality. Now, it's not intentionality in the way Searle talks about intentionality. It's not intentionality in the psychological sense of intentionality. It's intentionality in the sense of a directed relation. And this begins to bring out the fundamental point in the critique of that other kind of metaphysics. Because one of the big problems in the substance-based metaphysics is that it presupposes that you can have a thing that is real that's completely independent of everything else. But ultimately, a relational metaphysics says everything is in relation to everything else, which means that the fundamentality of relationality begins to supervene. And as we begin to see this, we begin to see then that at that elemental level of having that fundamental relation of directedness, you cannot work within old debates of universalities and particularities and a lot of those other models. The reason you cannot is because in that other kind of relativism, universal relative to what domain? If you're going to work within the question of particularity, the same problem. And as you begin to work from this, you begin to ask different types of questions. So I'm going to conclude by returning to my remark about African diasporic philosophy. Now, a lot of what I've been talking about has been in the form of what it can be called double consciousness. Now, there are two forms of double consciousness, okay? And you could see how even the phenomenological underpinning is connected to the notion of double consciousness. The first type of double consciousness is what we could call first-order double consciousness. It is where you simply accept the normativity of the given order. And so if it simply says to you, this is the way the world is, you accept that. And you could simply see yourself as seen by that world. So you know your perspective, you know yourself seen by that world. And then there's what we could call the potentiated form of double consciousness. The potentiated form of double consciousness is a lot like when I pointed out those Theodician arguments. It's a lot like when I began to bring up disciplinary decadence. It's a lot like when I began to bring up, in other words, the contradictions of a presumed completeness of the first kind, of the first order. This second kind, potentiated double consciousness, is where one, in pointing out the contradictions, expands the order of knowledge and has an expanded relationship to reality. However, that expanded relationship doesn't present itself as a closed system. It doesn't say, well, that was false reality, this is the right reality. What it does instead is to set up an ongoing practice of articulating the contradictions of the presumed universality of the original given system. It brings then a form of humility to the understanding of reality, while at the same time dealing with it as an ever-expanding reality. And I'll stop there. Thank you.